Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes, where we take a deep dive into John Keegan's monumental work, The Second World War. Today, our mission is to journey comprehensively through Keegan's entire narrative, understanding his key insights into one of history's most pivotal and, frankly, terrifying conflicts. It's a vast book, but Keegan helps us grasp the underlying forces that truly defined this global catastrophe.
And that's exactly what makes Keegan's approach so powerful for us. He moves beyond, simply recounting battles. Instead, he masterfully weaves together the profound human experience, the massive demographic shifts that actually enabled total war, the astonishing technological leaps that reshaped combat, and the sheer industrial might that became a weapon in itself. It's about how humanity, technology, and an unprecedented scale converged to make this war utterly unlike any other in history.
So let's really get into this. Keegan begins his analysis of the Second World War not just by looking at the first, but by tracing its roots much deeper into the past. He argues that the sheer enormity of the events in WWI, the scale of suffering, the global reach, the existential stakes compelled historians to seek far-reaching explanations, far more so than for earlier conflicts, which often seem more contained, right? What specific historical currents does he pinpoint that set the stage for this unprecedented scale even before WWI?
Right. He points directly to the common roots preceding 1914, emphasizing a massive demographic revolution in the 19th century. Think about it. Populations in states that would later fight in WWI doubled or even tripled. Germany, for instance, went from 24 million people in 1800 to a staggering 57 million by 1900. Keegan shows how this explosion in human capital laid the foundational numbers for the colossal armies that would emerge. And it wasn't just numbers. Improved health from better diets, thanks to things like, North American grain imports and cheaper sugar making basic staples palatable, meant these larger conscript classes were also physically stronger, better suited to carry the roughly 50 pounds of extra weight a marching soldier routinely carried.
That's a crucial detail, how the very health and growth of populations fed into this new military might. It's fascinating that even the physical improvement of peasants, once dismissed by figures like Marx as irredeemable for revolutionary purposes, played a tangible role in feeding these huge new armies. And of course, the newfound wealth of the 19th century state could now house, equip, transport, and feed them amply. This really does set the stage for a profoundly different military culture, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, and this raises an important question. What did these increasingly professionalized national armies mean for the nature of conflict and for the soldiers themselves? Keegan highlights how conscripts learned not just military drill, but also obedience and forged deep comradeship. He argues this prepared them for an ordeal more harrowing than any which soldiers had known before. Keegan's key insight here is how this unprecedented preparation for mass suffering became a prerequisite for total war, fundamentally changing the psychological burden on nations and individuals alike. It's a stark evolution.
Moving past the First World War, Keegan vividly illustrates how the seeds of the next global conflict were sown. He notes the rancor of these unfavored victors, nations like Italy and Japan, who felt, shortchanged despite being on the winning side, but especially the bitter resentment of the vanquished Germany. He frames Hitler's meteoric rise squarely around his intense, singular focus on overturning the humiliating Versailles Treaty, rearming Germany, and reclaiming historic German soil and national pride. How did Hitler manage to transform that resentment into such a formidable military machine?
Well, what's truly fascinating is Hitler's cunning strategy after the failure of his 1923 beer hall putsch. He realized he couldn't seize power by force, not then anyway, so he pursued it constitutionally with the specific aim of controlling the army and unleashing rearmament. By 1936, he had reintroduced conscription, building an army 5 times the size of the Reichswehr. That was the official name of the German army during the Weimar Republic, severely restricted, by Versailles. He wasn't just building a larger army, he wanted a war army, ruthlessly replacing faint-hearted generals, and even orchestrating the forced retirement of figures like Werner von Frisch on trumped-up charges to ensure absolute loyalty and aggression.
Wow, so his personal drive to create a war-ready force purged of any perceived weakness was incredibly intense. And that brings us to September 1939 and the first full-scale demonstration of the swiftness and power of blitzkrieg tactics in Poland. Keegan makes a crucial point, though. The term blitzkrieg wasn't even a German army term before 1939, but rather a coining of Western newspapermen. What was the reality of this new form of warfare, and why was Poland so utterly overwhelmed?
Yes, Keegan clarifies that the term itself was an outside observation. What happened in Poland was a combination of overwhelming force and a truly modern approach to warfare. Hitler made an accurate, brutal calculation that France wouldn't intervene significantly in the West and Britain could do little. The Poles, despite mobilizing their forces, were hopelessly outmatched by superior German numbers, 62 divisions, including 6 armored ones, against Poland's 40 divisions with no significant armor, and immeasurably superior equipment, including 1,300 modern combat aircraft. Keegan shows that it was less a specific doctrine named Blitzkrieg and more the Germans' successful application of combined arms, tanks, infantry, air power working together at a speed and scale the Poles just couldn't counter.
Okay. Having seen how Germany's military machine transformed Europe, Keegan then turns our attention to the pivotal events in the war in the West, 1940. He reveals how the Western democracies found their long-held stratagems just unhinged. Take the Netherlands. Their strategy of retreating into their waterlogged zone, a defensive area protected by floods. That was unhinged by German air power in a few hours, with airborne divisions landing directly in their heart. Unbelievable. And then there's France. The Maginot Line, famously described as that Western front in concrete, consumed French defense budgets for years, but it tragically left 250 miles of unfortified frontier with Belgium exposed. This seems like a monumental miscalculation.
It absolutely was. Monumental is the right word. This highlights the profound Allied failure of intelligence and strategic appreciation. They mistakenly believed the main German offensive would come through Belgium, sort of like the Schlieffen Plan from WWI again. But the Schwerpunkt, the main point of attack, lay in the seemingly impassable Ardennes forest. Keegan recounts the devastating moment General Georges, the French commander, broke down when the French front was broken at Sedan by the Panzer divisions, which breasted up or pushed directly towards the weakest Allied spot. The critical flaw was the lack of a strategic reserve. Churchill famously asked the French if they had any and was told, "Oh, Kieran, none, just none." It illustrates a profound failure of foresight.
Right. It's here where Keegan really lets us see Hitler's micromanagement, urging a direct, bold attack into France and pushing for tanks to be flung into the Ardennes. His generals initially resisted, preferring a more cautious approach, until Manstein's audacious plan aligned perfectly with Hitler's vision. And then the astonishing Dunkirk evacuation follows. It was a massive success for the Allies, sure, but Keegan underlines that it only became possible after Hitler's inexplicable stop order halted the German advance, and Göring's boastful but ultimately failed promise that the Luftwaffe alone would prevent the evacuation.
That stop order is one of history's great what-ifs, isn't it? The Battle of Britain then shifted the focus entirely to the air, becoming a direct test of air superiority. Keegan notes that the RAF fought on something like equal terms, managing to keep an astonishing 600 Spitfires and Hurricanes serviceable daily against the Luftwaffe's 800 Messerschmitts. That's quite something. This was a critical point. The Luftwaffe, designed primarily for ground support rather than strategic bombing or air superiority, it sort of stumbled. By mid-September, despite heavy British losses, the RAF had gained a narrowest of margins, just enough, and decisively prevented the invasion, a pivotal turning point in the West.
Okay, but the conflict, as Keegan expertly details, was never confined to Europe. He vividly illustrates how the very sinews of war, the supply of food, raw materials, weapons, also drove the conflict to truly global dimensions, especially in the Pacific and Atlantic. He states that supply of food, of raw materials, of finished products, of weapons themselves, lies at the root of war. Japan's dependency on imports, like, 40% of its steel? That directly fueled its conflict with the U.S., driven by America's reactive trade embargoes. So this wasn't just ideology, but fundamental economic survival, too.
Exactly right. This economic reality ties directly into the Battle of the Atlantic, where Germany's U-boats, under the brilliant Admiral Dönitz, aimed to strangle Britain by cutting off its vital supply lines. While Dönitz was remarkably effective, sinking an astonishing average of 19 ships for every U-boat lost during the most deadly period. Keegan points out Germany never achieved the 300-boat fleet Hitler desired to make it total strangulation. The Allies' eventual success in this grueling logistical battle proved to be, well, as decisive as any land victory.
From the Atlantic, Keegan shifts our gaze east with the monumental Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's decision to invade Russia was, Keegan argues, a fixed point of all he thought and did throughout the first half of 1941, end quote. Utterly consumed by his anti-Bolshevik and deeply rooted anti-Jewish ideology. What's chilling is that while Hitler prepared for this immense gamble, the Japanese, completely unaware of his plan, were simultaneously shifting their own strategies towards confrontation with the U.S. and British. It's a striking example of converging yet independent paths to global war.
It truly is, yeah. What's particularly fascinating here is the intelligence aspect. The U.S. actually had intelligence of Germany's intentions against Russia, even pinpointing a D-Day of June 22nd. Yet Stalin clung to desperate hopes of peace, partly because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that non-aggression treaty he'd signed with Nazi Germany. Keegan also details how the devastating Soviet purge of military leadership under Stalin had severely weakened the Red Army, hindering its ability to maneuver and adopt defense in-depth strategies. On June 22nd alone, for example, the Red Air Force lost 1,200 machines, a quarter of its frontline strength, a catastrophic blow right at the outset.
Wow. And the Pacific Theater indeed opens dramatically with the shock of Pearl Harbor. Keegan highlights the American magic system, their highly successful code-breaking operation that intercepted Japanese diplomatic traffic. They even knew November 25th was a key date for some impending action, but they tragically failed to identify the specific military moves due to stringent radio silence from the Japanese fleet. Compounding this, a crucial radar warning on Oahu was disregarded. It's a stark reminder of how intelligence, even when available, can be misinterpreted or just ignored.
And this failure had immediate, brutal consequences. In the Philippines, MacArthur's troops on Bataan were soon crowded into a tiny 10-mile square area with 26,000 civilian refugees, quickly dwindling to half rations. Keegan emphasizes this was a war of attrition on a scale unseen, a grinding horror that highlights the human cost of these opening moves. But then, as you noted, came Midway, which Keegan describes as a genuine tide-turning intelligence operation for the U.S.
Speaking of pivotal moments, Keegan details a truly astonishing 5 minutes at Midway. What exactly happened in that narrow window between 10:25 and 10:30 a.m. on June 4th, 1942? Why does he consider it the critical turning point in the Pacific?
Ah, those fatal 5 minutes. They truly stand out. During that brief window, 4 Japanese carriers, the very heart of their naval air power, were devastated by American dive bombers. Keegan brilliantly reveals that this single, concentrated attack reversed the whole course of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese First Air Fleet, with its magnificent ships, modern aircraft, and superb pilots, was shattered, a blow from which they never truly recovered. It demonstrates how a small window of opportunity, combined with crucial intelligence and, well, tactical execution, could have such monumental strategic consequences.
As the war progresses, Keegan pulls no punches in detailing the brutal reality of German occupation. He shows how in Eastern Europe, areas like Ostland and Ukraine were run as colonial territories, based on the Nazi ideology of Untermenschen, classifying Slavs and Jews as subhuman. This was starkly different from German occupation in Western Europe, though he makes it clear that coercion, repression, punishment, reprisal, terror, extermination were common instruments of control throughout Hitler's entire empire. It highlights the deeply ideological nature of this conflict.
Absolutely. And the human cost of this repression is laid bare, particularly with the millions of Soviet soldiers captured who died by neglect or murder at German hands. An unimaginable 3.3 million out of 5.16 million total captives. That figure alone speaks volumes about the savagery of the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Keegan traces Rommel's desert campaigns, a fluctuating battle of wits and logistics, culminating in Montgomery's deliberate infantry-artillery assault at Alamein.
What's Keegan's insight into that decisive battle at Alamein and the subsequent Allied push into North Africa?
Well, Rommel, despite his tactical brilliance, was in an impossible position. He refused Hitler's order to retreat and saw his tank strength dwindle to a mere 35 tanks left. Montgomery, on the other hand, was informed by ultra-intelligence, the decrypted German communications of Rommel's intentions, allowing him to press his advantage decisively. The Allied invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, was a complex political play too, forcing Vichy France's hand. And Keegan highlights Kasserine Pass as a brutal yet crucial lesson for inexperienced American forces. It led to Patton's command and a rapid improvement in battle wisdom. It shows how the Allies were learning and adapting, on a grand scale.
Right. From the deserts of North Africa, our attention turns to the massive undertaking of the invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord in Normandy. Keegan powerfully details how Allied deception became as crucial as firepower. He notes the success of Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception plan. That successfully convinced Hitler the main landing would be at Pas-de-Calais, leading him to fix 11 German divisions in Norway and crucially delay releasing forces to Normandy. This was a psychological battle as much as a physical one.
It was indeed, yeah. This raises an important question about how the Allies achieved their overall battlefield superiority in the West. Keegan explicitly states that, by comparison with the British and American armies, the German army belonged to a previous generation of military development, still heavily relying on foot and rail for movement rather than motorization like the Allies. Allied air power then systematically devastated the French railway system, making German maneuver and rapid reinforcement almost impossible. This wasn't just about fighting on the battlefield, it was about destroying the enemy's ability to even reach the battlefield effectively.
The fighting in the Normandy bocage with its 10 feet thick hedgerows must have been horrific. Keegan described it as death traps for American infantry. Yet the Allies, with their superior logistics, were able to reinforce divisions from southern England to Normandy in less than 24 hours. While German reinforcements took days or even weeks due to relentless Allied air attacks, this really underlines the sheer scale of the logistical and industrial battle.
Absolutely. This is where Keegan really emphasizes the industrial and logistical dimension as the decisive factor in the war. It's a core theme. Consider this. Soviet industry evacuated 1,523 factories eastward, relocating entire plants under German bombing, ensuring continued production in the most desperate circumstances. Incredible feat. Britain, despite being a major industrial power, liquidated almost the whole of its overseas holdings of capital, selling off assets accumulated over centuries just to pay for its war effort. And the U.S. saw an extraordinary economic surge, with aircraft production alone leaping from, 2,141 planes in 1940 to an astounding 96,318 in 1944. Keegan brilliantly reveals that these weren't just background details, they were the actual engines of victory. He shows how industrial capacity, the ability to produce and move material on a scale never before imagined, became as decisive as any battlefield strategy. It really highlights a shift in the very definition of military might.
So, with this immense logistical and industrial advantage, what does Keegan tell us about the final stages of the war, particularly on the Eastern Front, after the pivotal Battle of Stalingrad?
Well, after Stalingrad, the Russian advances were relentless, pushing the Germans steadily back towards Berlin. It was a massive tide turning. Keegan points to Hitler's desperate strategy of designating Führer fortresses, like Königsberg and Breslau, ordering them to resist to the last man. These garrisons did offer strong, fanatical resistance, but it was essentially a delaying tactic, bleeding Germany's last reserves rather than stemming the inevitable tide.
And what about Hitler's last major gamble in the West? The Ardennes Offensive, often called the Battle of the Bulge.
Ah, yes, the Ardennes Offensive. That was Hitler's desperate last-ditch effort to seize Antwerp and somehow break Allied unity. But Keegan details how it was doomed from the start by critical shortages of fuel and the ultimate failure to achieve genuine surprise. Despite initially confounding U.S. intelligence due to exceptionally bad weather and strict German radio silence, it was a massive, ill-conceived gamble that severely depleted Germany's remaining resources.
The stage was set, then, for the final push to Berlin. Keegan describes Hitler's fatal decision not to leave it thereafter, ensuring that the last great siege of the war would be Berlin's, fought to the absolute bitter end. And then, the ultimate weapon enters the narrative, the atomic bomb. Keegan contrasts the agonizingly slow progress of the German atomic project with the Allies being already close to fulfillment of their own.
Right. The devastating decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing 78,000 and 25,000 respectively, was followed almost immediately by a lightning-fast Soviet invasion of Manchuria. That invasion utterly overwhelmed the Japanese Kwantung Army. Keegan makes it clear that this combination of events, the atomic bombs and the sudden, overwhelming Soviet entry into the Pacific War, truly forced Japan's surrender, finally bringing an end to the global conflict.
Finally, Keegan confronts us with the immense, almost incomprehensible human cost of this war. He tells us Poland lost 20% of her pre-war population, some 6 million, half of whom were Jewish. A staggering loss. And perhaps most chillingly, he concludes that casualties were far higher in Eastern than in Western Europe, an index of the intensity and ferocity of war-making where Germans fought and oppressed Slavs. It's a stark reminder of the unique brutality that defined the Eastern Front. So we've journeyed through John Keegan's The Second World War, from the demographic shifts that enabled armies of unprecedented size, through the tactical brilliance and blunders of Blitzkrieg, the crucial battles of supply and air power, to the ideological conflicts that fueled horrific occupations, and the industrial might that ultimately determined victory. It's truly a masterclass in understanding total war.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Keegan really drives home how this wasn't just a series of battles, but a fundamental transformation of warfare itself. He argues that industrial capacity, logistical prowess, and even the health and sheer numbers of a population became as critical as military strategy. He shows us that the very definition of national power was irrevocably altered by this conflict.
It makes you wonder, given the sheer scale and destructive power that humanity unleashed in this total war, if we truly learned its profound lessons. or if we're still grappling with the echoes of those unprecedented challenges today.
That raises an important question for you to consider. In a world facing new forms of information warfare, global supply chain dependencies, and evolving geopolitical challenges, how much does understanding Keegan's deep dive into such a foundational conflict prepare us for the unexpected nature of future conflicts? Something to think about.